Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and we're going to have some fun today. Just going to have some fun. I hope you hang out with us. Hit that like button. Make sure you drop us some comments. And yeah, feel free to let us know what you think along the way today. I have a special guest. All my guests are special. I mean, if you come on MythVision, you're special, okay? Let's just call it what it is. That is Dr. Aaron Adair. Let's pop him up on the screen here. Welcome back, my friend.
Hello, hello. Good to be back again.
It's always good. For people who don't know, when I went to go interview with Paula Fredrickson, that like nobody has that opportunity. So super, super lucky to make that happen. We went to the Boston Museum. You hung out with us that day, me and Ryan, and we had a blast. But today seems like you've had a change of heart. It seems like you and me, we've been skeptical for so long. So we started listening to these undesigned coincidence apologists who were axe grinding for Jesus. And we kind of decided to apply some of their ideas to Eastern religions. And I'll just say this, I've accepted a whole different deity in my heart. And you shouldn't risk not doing so yourself today, ladies and gentlemen. So Dr. Adair, help us out. What are we doing?
So, we are going to be tackling the alleged method of proving that the Gospels are super duper reliable eyewitness documents, that they're not cobbling things together after the fact and making things up. No, they're legit stuff. But you dig in, you look at the logic, and you realize if we apply this correctly and universally, well, we need to pack our bags and move east to really learn what the true religion is, because boy oh boy, it's not going to be the blood of the lamb, it's going to be monkey magic that we're going to be interested in.
That sounds a little bit more fun than guys on crosses with blood dripping and crying out and agony and stuff. I think I want to have more fun. So if that's the truth, I'm following you, Dr. Adair. So lead me on the path of righteousness, my friend.
I shall do my best, Derek. I shall do my best. But don't you worry, we will still find plenty of things in common with our old ways. Some of the old stories we'll find in Eastern garbs, as well as very strong, empirical, philosophically sound ways of getting to enlightenment.
If I speak in tongues, it's because the monkey has possessed me here. Okay, so just bear with me.
All right. But in that case, I'll start speaking in tongues and Womakai Shiba. Let's get started.
Let's do it. Let me share your screen. Oh, you know what? I forgot to just mention.
Oh.
Get Dr. Adair's books. I pinned it at the top. He's got 2 of them. We're gonna cover these in depth. In fact, Star of Bethlehem, I'm hoping to put a documentary together on that one. We're gonna be working on that. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. Also, he's got a YouTube channel. For those who don't know, I'd like to see by the end if I can subscribe or see how many people we can get subscribed. We'll do a count. We're at 578 right now. Let's see where we're at the end. Let me add this in the chat so people can go and subscribe to the Priest of the East. And then we're going to check out your website here. Dr. Aaron Adair, just for those who don't know, he's a scientist trained in physics, education theory, as well as a scholar in areas of history, ancient science, religion. And he's just as much an academic, I would say better, than Lydia McGrew or any of the gals that, do this kind of stuff. So anyway, there's my little plug for you. Now to the presentation.
All right. So the logic that we're going to be tackling here is something that apparently is a very old apologetic, so old that basically it'd been rotting as a corpse in the academic, or I should say apologetic world for over a century, and then somebody decided to resurrect it. Would that make it a zombie? Would it make it a lich? I'm not really quite sure, but either way, it's brought back to life by some modern apologists and trying to show, oh yeah, the Gospel's totally historical, totally great, but I'm going to try to show that the logic of that sort of argument are what are called undesigned coincidences. There's already been a few videos here on MythVision about that. You might want to check them out. Go watch after this stream, of course. But we're going to see the logic where it fails, and if we did actually apply that logic, well, we should be reading some very different good books. So let's get started. All right. So this undesigned coincidence stuff, it's probably best that I don't tell you what it is, but I quote those who say what it is. So, for example, this quote from the Daily Apologists tells us what an undesigned coincidence is supposed to be. You have multiple accounts. They're supposed to be independent of each other, and the two accounts lock in together. One seems to have some sort of unanswered question that gets answered by the other, showing that, oh, they must come from some common source. This makes them totes legit, totes real. And the idea is, oh, we can apply this to the Gospels and show that the Gospels have common source. They go back to the real deals that what this Jesus said. I'm not really good with pronunciation sometimes.
Gotcha.
But yeah, now this, of course, is a quote from a website. And of course, as we know, if I quote from a website, is not the real source. The apologist who's probably made the most waves, the most efforts, is Lydia McGrew. Lydia and her husband, Timothy McGrew, they do a lot of theology, philosophical works. Lydia McGrew in particular says she does a lot of work specific to epistemology, which relates to this sort of stuff here. So these are a few quotes from her recent book called Hidden in Plain View, making the argument for the existence of these undesigned coincidences in the New Testament and demonstrating all sorts of good things about it. So putting this up here so you can see how she's arguing things, that you have two or more accounts of text that don't seem to be planned between these different people. So despite their apparent independence, the two stories fit together like pieces of a puzzle. And ultimately saying this provides evidence that what they're telling is actually true, that you wouldn't just get this by chance. This has to show there's some real thing going on, because it's like, well, what are the chances of these puzzle pieces just randomly slapping together? It must be the real deal behind it. She also says that these undesigned coincidences are the things you expect from real human testimony as opposed to myth making, and saying, hey, if we are supposing the Gospels are these sorts of like historical memoirs, then we would expect to see these sorts of undesigned coincidences. So these are all quotes from the intro and first chapter of her book, as quoted here. So you can go and check that I'm not quite making things up, though I do want to highlight again that if the apparent independence of the Gospels is apparently a starting point, but we're going to see that she doesn't quite hold to that. But details down the road. To try to show how undesigned coincidences are supposed to work, she gives this example of having a couple friends named Alan and Betty. They are telling you about this distressing conversation they had with a friend named Carl at a coffee shop. Carl's supposed to have said some really serious, not so good things, and you go and try to see if what they're telling you about Carl is actually legit. So you sit the two of them down separately, have them say what's going on in their own words, and they give you different details. And in particular saying, hey, one of them says the place was so crowded you couldn't find a place to sit. The other one saying one of their coffees got knocked over on their lap. And the idea is like, oh, these two stories work really well together because, hey, if it's a really crowded place, that would explain why the coffee got knocked over. So the idea is here, hey, these stories mesh together so well, they must be talking about the same ultimate event, and therefore a reason to believe this testimony about what Carl said. That is the analogy that's going on here. So far, so good?
I'm following you, yeah.
All right, because this is where I was trying to follow Lydia, and then I had to say, stop. Wait a minute. As presented, this is actually a textbook logical fallacy. So let's set up what she is saying. If you've got text A and text B, and they can be combined in some logically possible way, they somehow are claimed to fit together, then the combined story is more reliable. As she says here herself, undesigned coincidences provide a reason to believe that both or all of the statements that contribute to it are truthful. We are supposed to believe more so in what we are reading here if they can be combined together. The thing is, though, this is actually mathematically false. It is actually mathematically impossible, and it breaks the basic tenets of probability theory. And you can understand it in this fairly simple way, that what is the probability of A being true? Whatever that number is, it's somewhere between 0 and 100%. What's the probability of A and B being true? Meaning that both propositions have to be true for the overall statement to be true. Well, anytime that A is true and B is false, that won't work. And that is a different possibility space than just A. It will always be the case that A alone is more likely to be true than A, as well as additional criteria. Easy way to look at that is if you got a deck of cards. So regular 52 deck of cards, what's the probability that the card you pull out is a heart? 1 in 4. What's the probability that you pulled a card and it's a 2? It's 1 in 13. And if you doubt it, you can literally go and count how many hearts are in the deck, how many 2s are in the deck, and see what that fraction is over 52. How many 2 of hearts are there? It's only 1 in the whole deck, right? So if I say the card that's pulled out is a hearts, there's a 1 in 4 chance. If I say it is specifically a 2 of hearts, that is 2 things having to be true. And that is less probable. It has to be less probable because there's less opportunities for both of those statements to be true at the same time. This combination of saying A and B is more probable than A alone is actually an example of the conjunction fallacy, that the combination somehow seems more plausible to our intuitions, and so it seems more true, but in actuality, when you really think about the mathematics of it, it's impossible for it to be more true. So this is a rather frustrating thing to see coming out from a philosopher, someone who says she works specifically in formal and informal epistemology, the study of knowledge, and her starting premise of how this works is logically impossible. That's not a very good way to start things when this is how things are presented. Now, we could just say right there, okay, what she says is logically impossible, it can't work, we're done. But we can't have the presentation that short. How will we ever get to the one true faith that I'm ultimately trying to get you to? So we got a little more work to do, a little more work. And we're going to try to do...
Picking up the sarcasm, me and Dr. Aaron Adair, we don't believe. But you're going to see us have a little fun today. So I hope you can role play with us, put on your Kool-Aid drinking hat, and let's do it.
All right. So... all right, now I am going to try to reformulate what Lydia McGrew has put together, because when I go through her book, she never actually lays out the logic itself. She never actually explains how the premises lead to the conclusion. And again, very frustrating for a philosopher to say, here is this new, unique argument that's going to blow the socks off everyone that would just happen to be forgotten back in the 1850s, and not actually show how the conclusion follows from the premises. We're stuck inferring it. Now, because we're stuck inferring it, we can at least put it together in some way that's logically coherent, better than what I showed in the earlier case where it is literally logically impossible, but it also is along the way doing this makes me think she actually has not worked out the logic. So we're going to try to do it, set it up ourselves, put it in at least a logically valid form, and then see if the premises that go into that argument can actually be convincing to even us faithless, terrible, heartless skeptics.
Heathens, yeah.
I know. I mean, I want to sin so much, it's going to take a really logically strong case for me to change otherwise. So
Right. It's hard.
But, like I say, we're going to try to make a logically valid argument. And I should mention, when we say logically valid, that doesn't mean true. A logically valid argument, that specifically means in philosophy that the conclusion follows from the premises. The structure of the argument would mean that if the premises are true, the conclusion will follow. A sound argument is that it's valid and the premises are true, and so you do accept the conclusion. Right. I'm going to at least try to make it a valid argument, and then we'll try to look into the soundness of the argument.
Okay.
Now, the main thing, though, is, all right, we're supposing we have these two different sources, these two other books, and by combining them together, they fill in the details with each other. And we're also, just for the sake of argument right now, suppose they are actually independent of each other. They have independent access to sources. What follows? What say you, Derek?
I mean, if you say supposing two sources fill in details with each other, and suppose also these sources have independent access to other sources, what follows? I mean, I guess you could try to make a case and say, hey, they have information, they have some type of common tradition in which they have oral tradition that goes back to Jesus. They want to make it even stronger, though. They want to say this is eyewitness. They want to say this goes directly back and that we can trust these. I don't necessarily see that as the absolute conclusion. I could say that maybe there was early traditions floating around where they had this, but that was, I'm hoping that's what you're asking me to answer, because that's what I'm picking up here. I mean,
Yeah, and that's the direction that seems reasonable, though I want to even be a bit more general in that what we can say is they have a common source. But what is that common source? Is it a good source? Does it actually increase the historicity or accuracy of a story knowing that they have a common source? Just knowing there's a common source doesn't necessarily get you there. We have more argumentation that's necessary to get to that point. So this is why we need to actually structure a proper logical argument and see what does and does not follow. So here I am going to present a logically valid argument. So premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion. So premise 1 is if two stories have a common source, those stories are more likely to be true. Premise 2, the Gospels have a common source. Conclusion, the Gospel stories with a common source are more likely to be true. The conclusion does logically follow from the premises. If you believe premise 1 and premise 2, you would accept the conclusion, and that conclusion that some of the stories, those stories with a common source, are more likely to be true. That might also become grounds to say generally the Gospels are reliable. So you can see where that argument could go.
So let me just put this too, because this, I don't think this is being factored in here, but you'll get my point. And this is something I notice every time I come in to talk about this whole issue. Like, what are we dealing with? What is this material? If you're starting off assuming this is just history through and through, like it is what happened, then I could see why if someone assumes, they have to kind of assume that up front, and they use other materials to do so. They might find verisimilitude, people, places, and things that archaeology somehow helps them to draw this conclusion. Then you apply P1, P2, and C1, and you can see why they're going that direction. And so there's all sorts of other issues that I've noticed along the way that you have to deal with. But no matter what you do, I don't think they're persuadable. But
right. And the point, though, is ultimately going to be that even though this argument, as I have structured, is valid, meaning if you accept premise 1 and premise 2, you have to accept the conclusion, it's a sound argument. Should we accept premise 1 and premise 2? Are they actually evidently the case? Now, you have to think, so when you look at a premise like that, you have to think, okay, what are the background assumptions that go into believing that premise? So let's look at premise 1. If two stories have a common source, those stories are more likely to be true. So to believe that, you have to actually make some other underlying assumptions. In particular, that non-fictional works use sources, but myth and fiction, not so much. If myth is just as likely to have sources, then you really don't gain anything by saying, oh, this has a common source. It just also happens to be a fever dream. It happens to just be another myth. All right? You're not going to get very far unless you have that as a premise in there, hidden under that premise. Another point is, whatever those sources are, they need to be historical sources about the event being described. You can't just say, these two people have the same source, it happens to be the back of a Wheaties box. It's like, no, you need something a little bit more to the point of what's there, something that might have actually been at the events in question or had access to what was going on. That would actually be a source we would even want to start looking at. And then, of course, the question of how good is that source in the first place? If the source is a known liar, it doesn't matter how many independent sources repeat what that person says. If they're a liar, they're a liar. It doesn't matter how many copy pastes of that lie you have. So there's also the question of what that source quality is. If these three premises aren't true, these sub-premises, I should say, aren't true, you really don't see premise 1 being all that strong.
Right.
And
why
it's be worth noting.
All the points you just brought up, all of those points, every single one of them, by those who I'll call Apologists for the sake of it, because it's the McGrews, they want to die on the hill. They're not lying, right? They want to die on the hill. They're telling you real history. We're talking about sub P2 or sub P1B and then sub P1C. And of course, they want to say, hey, these are non-fictional works. I mean, why would you have this verisimilitude? When you point out how wild some of the stuff described in these accounts sound and look, then it becomes human. Then it becomes, you're just closed-minded with your worldview. So I can't wait to believe in the monkey god that flies in the sky. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But please.
That's all right. That's all right. Don't worry. The king is coming. The monkey king is coming. But...
oh my gosh,
okay. He will say things a little bit differently than that. Okay, so notice though that premise 1 has nothing to do with undesigned coincidences. There's no point that undesigned coincidences are there to bolster premise 1. Instead, it's in premise 2 where we say the Gospels have a common source. The idea is that undesigned coincidences show there is common source. There's a common event behind the narrative. So the idea is that undesigned coincidences imply common sourcing, which also conversely means that these undesigned coincidences can't be explained by something else, namely intergospel sourcing, Matthew using
Right.
Mark, for example.
And for the sake of argument, you're just assuming they're independent for the sake of this, which means you should draw a common source or common tradition at the very least, something somehow they have a common way of grabbing this information. They'll say it's way too specific. This is where I think there's like a trick going on here where they'll go, it's way too specific how these puzzle pieces fit. Therefore, they were eyewitnesses because they're so close to, like, they're answering each other's questions. And we're going, no, dude, like, they know their own material. They're filling in the gaps because they're looking at the other material. Anyway, you get the point, I'm sure.
All right, so here's now where we see where undesigned coincidences is even part of the argument to get to historicity. It's all about then the gospel sourcing, at least in this logically valid form, unlike what we saw before. But we see, though, that to get the undesigned coincidences to make that point, we need some further argumentation. We can't assume that, so we need to look at the logic of undesigned coincidences leading to common sourcing. So basically, this is a fairly straightforward logical argument as well. So premise 3, undesigned coincidences between two sources are caused either by chance, common knowledge, common sources, or intersource awareness. Premise 4, some undesigned coincidences, I won't say all, but at least some, are not caused by chance, common knowledge, or intersource awareness, meaning some undesigned coincidences show common sourcing. So again, this is a logically valid argument. If you accept the premises, you'll accept the conclusion. And this conclusion is needed as a premise or a sub-premise in the other argument for historicity. So premise 3 is basically just listing out all the possibilities. This is not a dilemma or trilemma. This would be a quadlemma, I believe, would be the term. There's 4 possibilities, assuming that there actually are undesigned coincidences. But to say it's not chance, common knowledge, or intersource awareness, we got some sub-premises. So namely, if you're saying it's not chance, you're trying to basically say the chance rate is very low. It's too low to account for the data. Now, what does Lydia McGrew or anyone else show that undesigned coincidences are rare in sources? Nothing I really saw. It's not clear what is the base rate, what is just the background rate that these things happen. And you would also need to know that, so you could also say how strong the evidence even is. If undesigned coincidences happen once between any two sources, then getting 2 examples isn't all that strong of evidence. But if these chance events are super rare, 1 in a million, then getting 1 or 2 is now strong evidence. What did they do to show the chance rate is actually low? Nothing really that I saw. It just was assumed. So we can put that to the side for now, but this would be actual research needed to do to even make the argument valid. Now, also, common background knowledge. Is there any way that the 2 people could have just known how things work out in the world and gotten things to mesh together? So, for example, maybe it's common knowledge that grass is green. Things like that, for example. I'm just throwing that out as an example for no apparent reason. If you were to describe grass and call it green, is that really because you have some amazing memory of what really happened, or that's just generally the case? And if you're going to describe grass anyway, it's probably green. Not really that big a deal, right? Or maybe a little bit more important for creating things related to the Christian religion is like, hey, how would someone interpreting scripture get to this sort of thing? It's like, oh, you interpret Isaiah 53 as about the suffering Messiah. Oh, and you also do. It's like, well, it's not because you guys both know the suffering Messiah. It's like, no, you're both reading about that suffering figure, and that's the common source for that idea, not necessarily for the actual event. So you got to show that whatever that is, whatever that cause between the 2 can't be described just by common background knowledge. Now, the premise, though, that really I think gets in the craw of the apologists because it goes so hard against what is in modern scholarship is the independence of our sources, in particular the Gospels. Basically, you have to assume, and this is why I put this in italics, that our extant sources, our Gospels, are independent of each other. They may know of each other, but they are independent of each other. They're not using each other. They have some common source. And to quote Lydia McGrew, that they are to an important degree independent. And independent, she also put in italics. Really emphasize, oh yeah, these gospels totes independent. Which also means that basically you might look at Matthew and Mark, for example. You see similarities between the two, but you also see differences, and you have to say there is no way this is due to redaction. This is not because Matthew took Mark and changed up Mark.
Right.
This has to basically be denied by apologists like McGrew, like McClaskey, like so many of the other apologists out there. But this also leads to a bit of a conundrum, because if we're saying Mark and Matthew, for example, have a common source, but they don't redact each other, and yet we're also going to say they have a common source and things are different, how can they have a common source and look different? Well, that means they both redacted things. They had a common source, they didn't exactly copy it, that's redacting. It's a really weird thing to say, there's no way they would redact another document and then show examples of redaction, right? That seems, at the very least, a tension in the argument. And the way to get out of that inconsistency is saying they're not using a common document. Their common source is their eyes seeing the same events. Basically, deep down in the argument is the Gospels themselves are primary sources. They're eyewitness accounts of what actually happened. And that's really the only way that you can consistently say there's no way Matthew and Mark are redactions of each other, and yet they have all these other similarities between the two. This is really at the heart of what they are believing, what they're assuming, and also, again, what goes against basically all of modern New Testament studies.
I think you said that really well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why they can explain why the differences are there, because then they'll try to bring up, well, you know, when a detective is investigating a crime and you have 3 suspects or you have 3 witnesses, they don't always say the exact same thing. Sometimes they might even contradict each other. And it's like,
yeah, when they're consistent with each other, that shows how reliable they are. And when they aren't consistent with each other, that just shows how much more reliable they are because they're not colluding. It's like, so apparently no matter what they say, it's always right. Yeah, that's what we call begging the question so effing hard. So my point here is that once we try putting the arguments in a logically valid way, we see that ultimately the premises are a bit questionable, and ultimately they assume a lot of what the apologist needs to prove in the first place to even get to those conclusions, and assuming these undesigned coincidences are even real in the first place, and everything else they want to assume about them, which means even if you give them a lot, it's still not enough. It ain't great, to put it mildly.
Right.
But we're not done. There's even more that we have to realize about just how strained their entire thought process is here. So let's go back to that example that Lydia McGrew gave of the 2 friends describing a conversation at a coffee shop. So I'm repeating the text here, and notice I have a few things in color. You have 2 friends. They give you distressing conversation details about what someone else had said or done, and you chat with them separately to get info from each other. Or to make this a little bit more abstracted, suppose that you have 2 known sources giving you direct testimony. And what are they telling you? Ultimately, a mundane claim. Carl said X. And you sit them down so you have independent witnesses. This is the setup that Lydia McGrew has in her book to then say, but they describe the coffee shop in different ways that can mesh together so we can believe the mundane claim. Let's make this a little, just a smidge closer to our situation with the gospel stories, where what do we have? We have 2 unknown sources telling you in anonymous documents written decades after in a foreign language using well-established literary tropes. Not direct testimony. And they're not giving you some mundane claim about Carl. They're saying Carl has all these unfathomable stories about flying around with the devil, feeding tens of thousands of people with almost no food, coming back from the dead, and flying into outer space.
I'm starting to be persuaded already by what you're saying, but go ahead.
Yeah. And of course, then you decide you want to get to the bottom of this. So you take these sources and you sit down with these documents that are copying from each other and changing things. This is basically the entirety of redaction criticism in biblical studies for like the last century. And so you see, of course, what these documents say in their own words. And by their own words, I literally mean they're copying from each other and some of it is verbatim. So it's not even their own words. the difference between Lydia's story and this is so huge.
So let me throw something at you to get your thoughts. I mean, obviously, I've not gone and like done a statistical. How common is it when, especially large, take the amount of words that are in the Gospels, all right, and let's just say they took 1,000 people who witnessed something, and you put these 1,000 people who witnessed a speech or something, you know, when they say they saw Mary in the sky, you name it, whatever, they interview them. How many you get? I mean, you got 4 people to choose from here. Okay. Really, it's just 4. But imagine we did it with 1,000 people. How many people, how often verbatim are we going to find the overlap and get their testimonies, right? What would we end up finding at the end of that? I bet you even with the 4 people, there's way too much in common. And this is why you hear them kind of like say stuff like, yeah, they're independent. They're dependent. And they're like wanting to not say they're dependent, but they're independent, but they are dependent. They want to avoid this. They are not willing to say, you know, what we're clearly seeing. But go ahead.
Oh, that's actually almost an exact quote from what Lydia McGrew says in her book, which I'm actually going to get to in the very next slide, about how the Gospels are independent enough to make her arguments.
How do you know that?
Good question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
but there's, I mean, when I look into it, you just see the circularity, and you just keep spinning and spinning and spinning. And take a look at the point, though, is that as we're noting here, undesigned coincidences seem to assume independence, and we kind of need that assumption so that way everything is actually coincidental. It's not because of redaction. So again, if you imagine if you have text A and text B, B knows A. If B uses A as a source and B is different from A, then the changes that B makes aren't coincidental or undesigned. That's purposeful. That's B deciding what to keep from A and what not to keep from A. They can't talk about undesigned coincidences at that point if you are literally saying this person is changing this from that source.
That's why you were very good at you rolled with their definition for the sake of argument using undesigned. We have a problem with that undesigned out the gate. I get it, but we're taking this slow and we're trying to use their own logic. Got it.
Yep. Well, we're trying to use their own logic, and we even see from their own examples that we are supposed to be assuming independent testimonies. That's even the example that Lydia McGrew gave with the separated witnesses getting their testimony. Now, of course, the problem is, talk to most New Testament scholars, and they're going to tell you, no, the Gospels are not independent. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are clearly cribbing on each other to some degree, and exactly that relationship is arguable, but virtually no one is just saying, oh yeah, they just all happen to have this triple tradition in them with a lot of verbatim copying. That's just total coincidence. No, almost no one believes that. Right. Relationship to John, that there's more argument there, but still looks like there's knowledge. Either way, it's hard to say that all 4 Gospels are completely independent in modern biblical studies. And yet, McGrew actually will argue that undesigned coincidences show independence, not assumes, but shows it. And this kind of flabbergasted me when I read this, so I had to include the quote. Even the 2 that resemble each other the most, Matthew and Mark, have undesigned coincidences that couldn't have arisen from copying between them. This is a reason to believe that they are reliable and to an important degree independent. So it's not that independence leading us to look for undesigned coincidences. It's now undesigned coincidences showing independence. That is literally circular.
So if I may pose the question back to you, based on your knowledge of recognizing the awareness of either a common source or they're using each other's sources and potentially have common sources. Who knows? At the end of the day, you're saying based on this statement, you could even take the opposite as true, technically. The fact that there are these coincidences that she wants to say are undesigned, you could even argue that no, actually, they could technically have all of these undesigned coincidences in common, and really, it's because of the crafting, not showing the dependent of independence or the degree of independence. It's showing the degree of dependence. You could literally flip this quote, what I'm saying, and say actually the opposite is true. Not
yeah. I would actually say that basically, especially if you do things like the argument from Editorial Fatigue, who made most famous by Mark Goodacre, when you see, hey, something that doesn't quite make sense in Luke, for example, but it makes sense in Matthew, this looks like a piece of evidence that Luke is using Matthew and was kind of fumbling getting it to work in the rest of his story. When something looks awkward in one source but looks cleaner in the other, that might be a sense of direction of influence. Mm-hmm. And so arguments like that, which shows like it's not an undesigned coincidence, it's a flub, and a flub that shows the direction of causality. So fundamentally, though, if an undesigned coincidence requires independence, you can't use something that requires independence to prove independence. And even if we assumed that undesigned coincidence could show some evidence of independence, there's still the question of how much. Her argument can't follow that the Gospels are independent because we have to compare what is the argument for their dependence and how strong is that. So let's look at the two cases here. What's the bigger coincidence? A random undesigned coincidence between Matthew and Mark, or exact copying of Mark's text by Matthew in the Greek language by pure chance?
That's my point earlier on saying get the testimony of 1,000 people. And I know that's a little bit off to the side of your direct point here, but like how out of 1,000 people who were at an event and you get their testimony and they spoke or wrote down as many words as we find in the gospel, how many out of 1,000 people, do the math, if someone put the statistics, would you find verbatim paragraph descriptions in common? No, you would walk away. I can almost guarantee you, even with 1,000 people. I mean, I have not done the math, but I would assume that much in common, that similar, even verbatim structure like that, you with 1,000 people, not 4 books, and really technically 3 with absolute confidence, but 4 books, 4 different people, and you're going to find that overlap? Come on, man.
And throw on top of that, it's also supposed to be all recorded in a language foreign to the people witnessing the events.
Right. They're sitting here speaking Aramaic, and you're going to tell me that all of this in Greek just so happens. There's a lot of issues here.
Oh, yeah. And of course, when we are talking about like there being overlap, let's put some numbers on that. If we look at the triple tradition, the traditions that are in common between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, over 50% of those words in those triple tradition are verbatim copied in Matthew as found in Mark. So we're not talking like, 3 or 4 words. We're not talking about a few sentences. We're talking over half of the words in the triple tradition verbatim copied in Matthew. Holy shnikes. Yeah. This is not what you get from anything other than deliberate copying and editorial changes.
And if you can honestly grant that, if you're being honest, if you aren't granting that, you're just being dishonest. Let's just call it what it is, because you have other motivations. If you're granting that, then you cannot, once you've done that, once you've recognized that, you cannot draw those undesigned coincidence assumptions. You can say, hey, I think, I'm going out on a limb, I have faith, I believe. You cannot make this case as if they're that independent when we show how dependent they really are. That's my point.
And especially we need to look at the scale of things, because how many undesigned coincidences are even alleged between Matthew and Mark, or between any 2 gospels in particular? And it's basically like 3, 4, 5 between any 2. So these 5 coincidences versus the hundreds of exact copying of words in order. Come on, that is not even worth comparing.
Yeah.
So, like I say, we have both circular logic, and the conclusion can't come from the premises because you actually have to compare the strength of evidences. And Lydia McGrew just doesn't. She just thinks her argument is just so strong she could ignore everything else. I would call that pretty shitty philosophy, to put it mildly. Oh, but we're not done. There's further complete logical flabbergasting coming along the way. And, oh boy, this really got me going. Okay. Here is the following quote. An undesigned coincidence provides reasons to believe that all the statements that contribute to it are truthful. Most of the time, the coincidences that I examine in this book will come from different authors, but that isn't always the case. Different passages in a work by the same author can also fit together in a special puzzle-like way, especially when they are far apart in the document. Oh, my Oh my.
I'm actually glad that she's saying this, though. It's like, let me show you my cards, and here you go. I mean, what do you do when you hear that? Like, I've already been feeling like we got an uphill battle just trying to convince them to say maybe there's more dependence than we're willing to grant in this literary sense.
Well,
but you start hearing this, that the same author who's writing in his own work or their own work is somehow that proves more validity to an undesigned coincidence within the same structure of the literature. Oh my God, man. That's
yeah. And again,
wow.
it's so mind-boggling because like the whole idea is that these are supposed to be coincidences that like, these authors aren't aware of each other. How can an author be unaware of their own text? Look at the logic that she's been providing, where she's saying, well, independence is needed to show undesigned coincidences, or undesigned coincidences show independence. Either way, there's this independence relationship. How can an author be independent of themselves? Blah!
So what was your added emphasis on this?
Oh, what I put in italics, that it's the same author providing these undesigned coincidences to themselves.
Okay, so you just added the italics, but she does say same author, correct?
Yep. This is an exact quote from her book. The only thing I added was the emphasis with the italics.
Okay. That's why I wanted to ask, because someone might try to, you took her out of context, or
I gave you the whole context. Believe me, it's no better.
wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and the thing that's so mind-boggling about this, I mean, yes, first off, it's logically insane to say that the person who wrote this is independent of their own writing. I mean, did Mark just like write down a paragraph and like knock themselves out and then started writing again, not remembering what they wrote the night before? And it's like, oh, what a coincidence. The story is holding itself together. What is she even thinking? And here's the other thing. What she's actually doing is showing how literature works. This is basic storytelling of having something earlier in the story connect to something later. It's the basics of setup and payoff.
Yeah, it's somehow it's interesting. I'm thinking about the very opening of Mark, where it's like, this is the genesis of the Son of God, right? Jesus.
That's the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew.
Well, in Mark, there's an opening where it's saying like, hey, I'm telling you about the Son of God. And later in Mark, you have this centurion who kind of full circles the narrative, full circles the point of the beginning of the book. And I would imagine, using her kind of logic, if I put the Jesus cap back on, it would be like, well, they said what he was at the beginning, and guess what? We have an independent voice that isn't Mark's voice. And he was a centurion, and Mark tells you what the centurion said. So we're going to trust this literature so much that this centurion at the cross, who's writing this down,
but
who knows?
If that's the case, then you have to believe in the one true faith of Harry Potter, because you find this exact sort of thing in those sorts of stories. So just an example from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone for Americans. Early on, it's established that Ron Weasley is good at chess. Okay. That's something the narrator or in the story points out. Later on, in like the final chapters of the book, there is this case where they need to be able to solve this chess puzzle so that way they can get to the final boss of the book. So literally, we had the setup, Ron is good at chess, payoff, Ron saves the day with his chess skills. It must be an undesigned coincidence, and J.K. Rowling is providing us absolute wonderful testimony of a wizarding school in Scotland.
But J.K. Rowling didn't mean to do that. The divine hand behind the pen of J.K. Rowling actually constructed the reality of the chess playing magical motif, and how this
of course, I think we need to truly go to our one and true savior when it comes to undesigned coincidences and the hand of God. And that is with every episode of Seinfeld written by Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld together, where it's just a whole bunch of coincidences coming to a crescendo at the end, where all those weird things and the side characters just crash together for the final denouement. It's like literally every episode of Seinfeld is this sort of thing, a whole bunch of little coincidental things accidentally leading to the final result, usually, something bad for George or what have you. So it's like, does Lydia McGrew think Seinfeld is a documentary? Does she know what a joke is?
Well, obviously.
At this point, her apologetics is a joke.
Right. I mean, obviously, we're being funny here, and I know that they take this serious. That's why. And
if they took it seriously, if they really took it seriously, they would realize what they are describing here with undesigned coincidences within the same author is an example of inclusio, of chiasmus, of literary structuring that you find as part of ancient writing practices, which also shows this is an oral tradition.
right. So what we have constructed, even if you argued there were oral traditions somehow behind the literature, the product we're reading isn't just here's what actually happened verbatim orally. We're just going to write that down, or this is the testimony of Peter exactly, which to me, oh my gosh, the ending of Mark just nails that to me. The fact that the women told no one, it also explains why the Jerusalem church was destroyed in 70 in my observations. But this is a whole, like, gosh, there's so much here. What I meant by she takes this serious isn't necessarily her own argument, and I know you're poking holes in that. I'm saying they have motivated reasoning to believe and to try and make sure that their faith is true on every level. There's, downplay these issues, try to make these things come together. They've got like this, I guess it's the worldview. That makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely worldview that's driving this because, like I say, this isn't even logically coherent. She has not stopped to actually think, how does this fundamentally work? How do my conclusions draw from there? What things would and would not be examples of undesigned coincidences? She's just trying to find anything to throw into this, scramble it all together, and say this now proves her maximalist case that the whole shebang is completely reliable and we should be believing in, well, basically flying space Jews, which is really the final point of the story.
So it's just as logical to believe that a flying space Jew named Jesus actually is flying, and then monkey gods also fly in the heavens, correct?
Now, to be fair, Jesus doesn't just fly. He's not flapping his arms. He's not going like Superman. He uses a cloud.
Right, right.
Which is, as we all know, the technology you use to fly around in the sky.
Right.
By the way, the Monkey King will do the same thing.
Yeah. We're getting there.
All right. So obviously there's just a whole bunch of illogical nonsense in this book. And when I say nonsense, I mean literally it's not even logically coherent. I can say that because I've shown it. It is literal logical fallacies. It's circular reasoning. It's non sequiturs. And this is coming from a philosopher who does her work in epistemology. It is frighteningly bad. So let's step back and try to think a little bit more carefully about how this is supposed to actually work if we don't grant basically every single premise the apologist wants to get to their conclusion. So let's back up and again say, all right, the logic of undesigned coincidences might give us some reason, perhaps we can argue that it gives us some reason to believe that two documents have a common source. But we can't just jump from common source to historically more likely. Just because a source is cited doesn't mean that source itself is historical. To give an example, we could have lots of copies of unreliable sources. That doesn't make them better. Or here's another idea. Imagine two people independently take pictures of a Bigfoot statue from different angles. How many pictures of a Bigfoot statue do you need until you believe Bigfoot is real? What? It doesn't follow at all because it's a picture of a statue? Yeah, that's right. Taking a picture of a statue proves nothing about the real thing. In the same way, if your source is crummy, no matter how many sources cite the crummy thing, it's still crummy. You don't make it better by copy pasting it. So the thing is, what do we do to show the reliability of the underlying source, assuming that such a source exists? This is where we would actually do proper historical method if we were to go through the process like a proper historian and see where things go along. So you would start off, and this is kind of a textual heavy version of doing history, but you would first do textual criticism. What's the oldest form of a text? What's its textual history? So you can see what might have been added or removed over time. Once you actually have some reconstruction of the text, then you can ask questions about what, if any, sources that text relied on, what kind of source is this text we're looking at, or what kind of source was this text using. And really, already right here, this kind of source, this quality of source, already is not addressed by undesigned coincidences. We're already now past anything that undesigned coincidence can do for us. All it can possibly do, even possibly do, is show that there is a source. It tells us nothing about the quality of that source.
Right. I mean,
So is it primary? Is it secondary? Is it the back of a cereal box? We can't
right.
say.
So just making that point, no matter what method you use, you can use undesigned coincidences. You can use, the Farr hypothesis, right? And what is the Farr hypothesis suggesting? Matthew and Luke have a source, and it's Mark. And even so much so that Mark Goodacre's not saying there's a Q source. He doesn't say there aren't possible sources that Mark is drawing their information from, or Matthew or Luke. He doesn't deny that there could be sources. He just doesn't take the whole Q and then reconstructing of Q to the bank. The point is, he is assuming they have common sources and they are each other in some way, shape, or form, using that kind of puzzle piece idea. This is the synoptic problem. Now, they're going beyond and going the full maximal possible way of trying to make this all true. And your like entire point building up is that you're saying, look, we have different ways in how these people are trying to assess this information. And even if we grant this has a common source, using their method, using their whole suppose that undesigned coincidences are there, like they're trying to say, they could have a common source of some legendary tale about Jesus, for all we know. That's why they want to go right back to an apostle. They want to die on the hill on taking it back to Peter, taking it back to a guy who was there, and they want to nail down the most, we go right back to a guy who was there, who saw it happen. We can take his word for it. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And they're not even saying that. I mean, honestly, what Lydia McGrew is trying to argue is that the Gospels aren't even using common documentation. They just have the same eyeballs looking at the same events. So that basically Mark was written by Mark, Matthew was written by Matthew. Even though she says that's not her premise, she's basically trying to say, well, the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. And so we'll also just believe the church tradition that Matthew was written by Matthew, etc.
Right. And in Mark,
and of course, and like I say, it's worth noting, again, just because you have a common source doesn't tell you who wrote that, where they wrote that, when they wrote that, what kind of way they wrote that, nothing about the quality there. If Mark had sources, okay, when were those sources written? 5 minutes earlier? Well, then it's probably not that much better, is it? How do we show that if Mark had a source, it goes back to the year 33? You can't do it with this method, at least.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about historical criticism, where we're comparing sources. How reliable are these sources? How do they compare to others? How does it fit our background knowledge? Would we ever say, well, Matthew and Mark, these two books have a common source, therefore we should believe all the fantastic things it says? It's like, no, our background knowledge is still pretty strong here. Just because two people talk about, I don't know, flying monkeys coming out of people's butts, but doesn't mean we necessarily should believe flying monkeys are, well, not coming out of people's butts. Let's just say they're popping out of stone eggs on top of mountains that have been there since creation, just as a story, just for sakes. All right, so it seems like I think I've made a pretty decent case here of a lack of logic. But before we go on to further see the consequences here, I don't know if we want to take a break for any super chat questions.
No. I don't think we have any.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, guys, make sure you get those in.
If we have any, but
all right.
I think we just blast through here, and then if anyone has super chats at the end, we'll take their questions.
Super. Okay. So at this point, though, like I say, I'm laying out the logic. I'm going through. I'm creating logical argumentation, showing the strengths and weaknesses of these premises. But really, we need something with some real historical heft. Some more rhetorical heft. And I need to reintroduce probably the strongest rhetorical argument that the logician has. I think it's time we properly go and bring in reducto ad absurdum. And here's going to have fun.
Yay!
We got Japanese disco, guys. Come on, enjoy.
Oh my gosh.
I am hoping some people in the audience happen to notice what this is.
Is this like a well-known?
Oh no!
This isn't well-known. Oh my god! Is this the creation myth or something?
Oh no! I am introducing you to a television series from late 1970s Japan called Sayuki. Was dubbed into English and seen especially like in England and Australia, and it was dubbed, and the show is called Monkey. Though many people thought the show was called Monkey Magic because of the earworm of a intro song that this had. And the song itself was actually composed in Japan. It's disco themed. it'll be stuck in your head all day.
Oh my gosh.
And this is all based off not a Japanese story, but the Chinese novel Journey to the West, 西游记, from the 16th century, written during the Ming Dynasty. And it is basically one of the 4 classic novels of Chinese culture. It is hyper influential in Far East Asian cultures and stories. It's all over the place. And as you can imagine, it's also got like a bazillion adaptations, which means it's ripe ground for looking for undesigned coincidences between those tellings. Here's the logic that we're going to apply. We're going to look at 2 tellings of the story of the journey to the West. And we will see that these 2 independent tellings of the novel will fill each other in and prove the ultimate truth of this story. Now, I have to assume that not everyone has read this book. It's a little bit large, so I have this copy here of Journey to the West. Okay, actually, this is the abridged version. Here's volume 1, and 2, and 3, and 4.
Wow.
So it's a little bit more compact if you read it in Chinese, but this is the pretty much right now the current definitive English translation with lots and lots of scholarly notes by Anthony Yu. Where was this published out of? Chicago, University of Chicago. So if you want some light reading for Christmas time, there you go. And like I say, this is one of the 4 classic novels of Chinese culture. And we're going to try to see in that story and its ultimate other tellings, just can we show that these 2 different sources have undesigned coincidences between them, proving they have a common source. And because we have that common source, we can check to see that our logic did follow. And then what comes true from that? Well, obviously, that we should believe this story. The story, it looks really long, but here's all it is. People going to get books. The end. Obviously, a whole lot more than that happens in like the 1,000-ish pages that I was just showing there a moment. The basic, it's a fundamentally Buddhist novel. Stories of multiple characters who are traveling from Tang Dynasty China to India to get sacred scriptures from the Buddha himself to basically bring enlightenment to the world. And along their journey, they have all these redemption arcs because of things that the characters had done in their past that they're being punished for, or they're going through reincarnation and trying to reach their final forms before entering basically heaven. And along the way, lots and lots of adventures happen. So I'm going to look at 2 versions of this story. One is a classic TV adaptation from the Chinese Central Television Station from 1986. This one is still a classic amongst pretty much all millennials in China. It's the thing that my wife watched when she was a kid living there. So it's very big. And the other version I'm going to look at is a much more recent cartoon version that is basically for little kids and other people trying to learn the Chinese language. So it's a much more simplified version. One is not trying to use the other to tell the story. They're going back to the original novel and presenting it to different audiences. And a good thing, too, because the one that's from Little Fox here, it's meant for little kids, and there's some very violent and naughty things that probably shouldn't have been in the kids' version, which fortunately they removed. I'll give some details about that along the way. All right, and also, so we all are on the same page, I should probably introduce some of the major characters. Who's the most important character, you could argue, but I would start off with the character of Tang Sengzang. Sometimes it's also translated as Tripitaka. He is a reincarnation of another holy man, and he is basically given this mission of traveling from Tang Dynasty China to the Western Paradise to get the sacred scriptures from Buddha and bring them back to China. It's a long, treacherous journey with lots and lots of monsters along the way. He is completely peaceful. He's vegetarian. He is not going to fight. He needs protection. He needs help. And so he has several companions that come along the way to help him, including Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, Zhu Bajie, sometimes also translated as Pigsy. Wujing is the character also called Sandy, and the horse he rides on for a good chunk of the story called White Dragon Horse. How he gets that name, I'll explain later. All these characters have some interesting backstories. Sun Wukong is probably the most interesting character. Like the first several chapters of the book is all about his origins, basically how he was born from a stone, how he learned the secrets of immortality, eventually learned all sorts of magics and superpowers, caused trouble in hell and in heaven, and had to be basically put down by the Buddha himself and punished by being held under a mountain for 500 years. Bajia, or Pigsy, he was originally in heaven, but he, well, let's put it not so nice terms, sexually assaulted the moon goddess, and so was punished for living on Earth as a pigman. And Wu Jing basically broke some jewelry in heaven as well, so he is forced to suffer on Earth until he receives redemption. So these characters are going along with Sanzang to basically help him there in hopes of redemption. Along the way, lots of adventures happen, and sometimes even their combined abilities aren't enough, and so they might need to get help, and the god or goddess that helps them the most is Guanyin Pusa. She's originally from India, and she's basically a goddess of compassion, and she usually comes in and does the Deus Ex Machina thing to help save a problem that these characters get themselves into when trying to save Sanzang. And Sanzang keeps getting into trouble because all these monsters are around. They see him, they hear he's a holy man, and everyone knows that if you eat the flesh of a holy man, you'll become immortal. So that's his trouble. He looks delicious. So that's the basic setup of this story. And some of these characters might also look a little bit familiar to you if you have been watching anime for quite a while, because Wukong in Japanese is pronounced Goku. The pig friend Bajia basically is our friend here, Oolong or Wulong from Dragon Ball. Pretty much, it explains a whole lot. Why does Goku have a tail? He's a monkey. Why does he fly around in a cloud? That's how Wukong would fly around. All the karate things he knows, all the magics he knows, basically, especially early Dragon Ball, is very directly influenced by Journey to the West, as is so much else in manga and anime. So basically, you're going to have to read this book if you really want to get deep into understanding a whole lot of Japanese and Chinese culture.
Wow.
So that's our starting points. So once we show these undesigned coincidences in these two versions of Journey to the West, we will prove the power of the Monkey King, the truth of Buddhism, and of course, why everyone should call their one true master Goku, protector of Frieza, protect us from Frieza, hallowed be his name. Oh, we're going to have a lot of fun, aren't we?
I love Dragon Ball Z. I grew up on it. And, you know, when you're a kid and you're reading it, what's interesting is that you're like purposely indulging in mythology, fiction, and you're in the world. You love the characters. You fall in love with the storylines. You get connected. And if they weren't telling it in a story way, even the way humans work, something could happen. The way we reconstruct it when we tell the story about what happened is usually never exactly how it happened. It's always a reconstruction that we want to tell in a way. We have a way in which we're trying to say it so that people are like, whoa, and it gets exaggerated oftentimes. So I just say that to say, like, I was lost in the world of Dragon Ball Z growing up, loved it, every single part of it. And that's why I thought this was going to be a cool one to talk about.
All right. So, shall we begin our journey to the West?
Let's do it.
All right. So, let's start off with our first apparent contradiction. Ooh, I used the C word. I know, terrible. But because you are just a heathen trying to block out the true enlightenment, we're going to have to guide you through this apparent contradiction that I'm going to show you and reach the truth underlying the story and our first undesigned coincidence. So here's our setup. Along in our journey, so far, Wukong and Bajia have joined Sanzang on his journey to the west, and at this river, the flowing sand river, they have a problem trying to get across, and they are being also harassed by a monster in the water. This monster ends up being Wu Jing, who will eventually join their party. He's a water creature, so he's living in this river, and they need to get him out so that way they can neutralize him. Now, Wukong, in the left side, from the story from Little Fox, you might not be able to read the Chinese, but basically he's saying right there, hey, Bajia, I don't swim well. I can't go into the water, basically. However, in the CCTV version, the classic version, it's not that Wukong says he can't swim, he's just saying that Ba Jia is a better swimmer than him. Which is actually strange, because up to this point in the show, we've never even seen Ba Jia swimming in the water at all. Why would we even think that? And in fact, if we go back in the show, in both versions, we see Wukong is just fine at swimming, it seems. In the animated Little Fox version, you can see him swimming to the ocean. He's diving down to go see the Dragon King, who lives underwater. In other scenes, he's transforming himself into a fish and swimming around in the ocean, or swimming around in the river.
Leviathan, Lotan, that's who he's going to see. But go ahead.
Oh yeah. And because he's the Monkey King, he also can go underwater and still kick butt. But he's saying he can't actually swim underwater, or he's not a good swimmer, even though we have all these scenes showing that he can do that just fine. And again, why is he saying Ba Jia is the better swimmer? We haven't seen any evidence of that in either the animated version or in the live action version. So we seem to have a contradiction. Oh no. Is our true scriptures already corrupted? Oh, never fear. This is just an apparent contradiction. When we combine the stories together and realize the underlying truth, we will see what's going on here. So as it progresses a little bit after this point, what is going on is not saying that Wukong can't swim. It's saying that Ba Jia would be the better candidate to go into the water and basically flesh out Wu Jing, this water monster that's in the river, and basically have him come out chasing Ba Jia, so that way Wukong can really take him out, because he's much better at fighting on land than in the water. Ba Jia himself will say in the live action version that before he was punished, that he actually led 80,000 sailors, so he knows all sorts of water magic tricks and things like that. He's already plenty with water stuff, but the thing is, though, is again, it was, how did Wukong know that Ba Jia was the better swimmer in the first place? That conversation didn't happen earlier, and yet he seems to know that. This exposition comes late. There seems to be some underlying source that it can explain why Wukong is saying he's not capable, and Ba Jia is more capable. So just to put this in text so we have this all in one place, according to our sources here, Wukong's swimming ability, according to the Little Fox animated version, Wukong can't swim well, even though we saw that he could. The CCTV version said that Ba Jia is the better swimmer, but we never saw any evidence of that. Only with later exposition is that revealed. If we combine the two versions and say Wukong isn't that capable underwater, Ba Jia is, then we can understand why he's the one diving into the flowing sand river to try to fight and push out the monster that's down there. So perhaps there is some common source that can explain the whole thing, some undesigned coincidence that's drawing on this common source. And lo and behold, if we go to chapter 22 of Journey to the West, Wukong explains that basically, even though he's usually a braggart, in this case, he can't brag. He doesn't really feel comfortable going underwater. Just to go down there, he has to do magic spells and water repelling spells, things like that, just to even move around. If he even wants to swim well, he needs to transform himself. He just doesn't have the list of skills to really fight underwater. On land or in the air, he's great, but as this translation puts it, doing business in the water somewhat cramps his style. Then Ba Jia explains, well, in the past I was the leader of 80,000 sailors and I know waterbending tricks sort of things, so he's the more capable one. And then they agree Ba Jia should jump into the water, fight the monster down there to draw him out, so that way they can neutralize him. So, as we've seen, we have an undesigned coincidence between the two tales showing the underlying truth of what is actually happening here. Do we believe in the Monkey King now?
You're starting to convince me. I mean, he's, I want to fly on a cloud one day. And if I don't believe, I won't be able to fly on a cloud one day like him. So I'm starting to think. Please keep going though. All right. I need a little more. You know what I mean?
You need more. Okay. Oh, ye of little faith. I've already deconstructed an apparent contradiction for you and showed the real truth behind, but you want even more. So
I need more.
Fortunately, in my infinite enlightenment, I am going to show you a story with not one, but two undesigned coincidences combined.
I can feel.
Shall we start?
Let's do it.
All right. So we go to another river and we'll have another problem crossing these rivers. So this is a little bit earlier in the story. Bajie has not joined with them yet. We have Wukong and Sansung traveling along, and Sansung's horse is carrying him, but they get to this river, the Eagle's Sorrow Gorge, and they have a problem. In that river, there is a dragon, and that dragon eats the horse. Oh, that's a problem. Now, that's just one of many problems. The other problem, of course, is, well, how do you cross the river at all? How do they ever get across? In the CCTV version, we never actually see them get across. It's just, here's a scene where they're on one side, and then later they've somehow gotten across. Where did that go? It goes unexplained. But remember, Undesigned Coincidences is two different versions. One creates a question and the other one answers it. Well, in the Little Fox version, the baby show for babies, we actually get the explanation that a boatman appears to take them across the river, and that boatman actually happens to be the local river god. So, we now have the adult version missing something, and the child version filling in the gaps. Combine them together, boom, problem solved. So far, it seems like, all right, we got one undesigned coincidence, but we are led to another problem, though. I mentioned that the horse was eaten by this river dragon known as White Dragon. Well, guess what? White Dragon will become Sansung's new horse. He'll be transformed into this beautiful new white horse. Why? In the Little Fox version, Guan Yin comes in and says, that's what you're going to do. And the dragon just listens to whatever Guan Yin Pusa has to say. He just follows orders from this deity of compassion. But why would he? It goes unexplained. We see he's deferential, but we don't understand any backstory. In the CCTV version, we are given a lot of backstory to explain that White Dragon used to live in a nice underwater paradise with his cousins, and he basically got angry because it looked like his bride was going behind his back. And in the process, he's lighting things on fire and destroying heavenly jewels. He is being punished, but Guan Yin is coming in to basically find a way for him to get redemption. And part of his redemption is to help Tang Tsung cross and get to the west to get those sacred scriptures. So that's why he's willing to join the party and basically replace the horse that he ate. So now, this is the same scene. We're talking like the same part of the story, the same chapter of the book. Two undesigned coincidences, one from each source, filling in each other.
So one is filling in from the other, the question, and then the other one's filling in from the other one, is your point?
Correct.
In both directions.
Yep. And we can check that they are actually undesigned coincidences from a common source, because again, if we go to chapter 15 of Journey to the West, the whole thing is explained there. The river god that takes them across, why the White Dragon decides to become the White Dragon horse. And that's why he's called White Dragon Horse, because he's literally a white dragon turned into a horse. Exactly. And so all of that gets explained. You get two undesigned coincidences in one story. Boom. Show me where the Gospels do anything like that.
I mean, they do try to argue. That's one of the things I brought up was, you can show dependence, and they have constructed the same way you have just constructed these elaborate explanations for these what look like answering each other's questions kind of stuff. And some of them I looked at and I was just like, I don't see the problem. Like, I don't get what you're trying to get at here. It didn't make any sense, but they were trying to say one of the Gospels is answering the question from this other one. I didn't see it. But with what you just said there, you got me starting to think I'm going to start keeping my eye out on the sky and seeing if any clouds with monkeys are flying, because, this might be the case. It just might be the case. You've got me starting to think, But that's the thing they'll say is like, yeah, but how much literature answers the other literature cross undesigned coincidence explanations being solved like the Gospels? That is the kind of, and it just sounds more and more like I'm going to make this more and more unfalsifiable for you so that you can just leave me alone and let me have my faith and let me tell the other Christians how they need to become maximalist. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And since, as we saw before, the entire logic itself is illogical, then if you could also just change the criteria on the fly, it's not just a frustrating argument. It's not even an argument anymore. At the very least, if we're going to be consistent, I just found more solid, more dense observations of undesigned coincidences, and I can show much more likely that our sources are independent. They do have a common source because we literally have it. I can show you it. Can you show me that with the Gospel's common source? No, I literally have it in my... when I say in my hands, I mean literally in my hands.
So you're telling me that is an infallible, inspired by the monkey god king text?
Oh, we can get even more inspired if you want.
Well, okay, I'm following you, man. I'm
Because here's the thing. I just showed you a couple of examples between two versions. One a classic and one baby show for babies.
right.
Do you have any idea how many different adaptations there are out there that we could be doing these comparisons for? There are dozens of versions of Journey to the West. You have movies, you have TV series, you have comics, you have stage plays. I'm just showing a few images here. You got like a Japanese version of the story of Sun Wukong from Toho Studios, the ones who do all the giant monsters like Godzilla. You got the manga version where Sun Wukong is in a steampunk world. You got the Doraemon version, so you got Machine Cat also flying around doing things as they're journeying to the West. You got other animated versions. You got stuff from Hong Kong. You got stuff from Japan. You got stuff from Thailand. You got stuff from Canada. There are so many versions that we could go and do these comparisons for, and we could find so many more and more and more and more undesigned coincidences.
Yeah,
but there's more and more opportunities to find them now.
Let me be critical here, okay? And you got to answer this since you know this material. But the Gospels have like real places.
I'm gonna get there. Don't you worry.
Okay, man, because I'm kind of like thinking, because we share a common magical world, I think a Jesus guy could float into the sky and die and do this crazy stuff that you're describing. So like, it's not ridiculous, Aaron, for me, since I believe in these ridiculous claims, to just come over and believe in your ridiculous worldview. If you could just give me more information about like real people, places, and things, maybe. Because then it might sound like they're actually placing this in a real setting, making it more believable to me. Does that make sense?
You really want me to jump ahead? I gotta go slow. I gotta take you nice and slow. First date sort of thing. We gotta go slow, okay?
Okay, I'll take it slow. I'm just. You can see my frustration here.
All right. Now, to be serious, though, we're looking at all these possibilities of more places we could find more and more and more undesigned coincidences. What does this do to show anything about the historicity of these stories? If we found 10, 100, 1,000 undesigned coincidences.
Nothing. Just that it's a popular thing. That's it, yeah.
That's all you're finding. You would just find, hey, people tell the stories in different ways. You can they fill in some gaps with each other because of a common source, and that's all you can say. They have a common source, a fantasy novel from the 16th century. That's what they got in common. We've proven absolutely jack and squat about the historicity of the story at this point using this. Unless you really think the Doraemon version of the Machine Cat from the future actually reveals anything historical about Tang Dynasty China, okay?
Right.
Just saying. Now, so far, I've actually been holding back when it comes to undesigned coincidences, because so far, I've only been looking at what the apologists call internal undesigned coincidences.
Right.
That is basically different things within the same book, the same versions of the story. But also there are external coincidences that also might show that our story is real. Let's talk about the elephant demon, the yellow-toothed elephant demon. And don't tell me that you don't believe in elephant demons. Come on, we all do that. But
I'm open. I'm open. Okay. I don't have a human worldview, so I'm open.
All right. So here's the thing. In a later part of the story, Sun Wukong and company have to fight a trio of demons: a lion demon, an eagle demon, and an elephant demon. The elephant demon is literally named Huangya Lao Xiang, which basically means yellow-toothed elephant demon, or old elephant. Now, the thing is, elephants aren't indigenous to China during its imperial period. So once it actually started having like a unified empire of sorts, elephants had basically gone extinct in that part of China. You'd have to be hard-pressed to go and find them. We even have a source from the early Han period describing and saying that it's actually really rare for people to see living elephants. At best, they're going to find skeletons. And elephants were really almost never part of the war apparatus of the Chinese military, especially during the Ming Dynasty.
Hmm.
And this is the dynasty on which the version of Journey to the West was codified. So it would have been really hard to know anything about elephants. You couldn't have gone to the zoo and see them. They wouldn't have been part of the military. You'd have to go hundreds, if not thousands of miles to see living ones, most likely. And if you looked at depictions like the one I have here, that's actually a drinking vessel. It's missing certain features like tusks.
Hmm.
So if you were just some scholar just sitting in northern China writing a book, you probably wouldn't know the details of elephants, right? But in Journey to the West, the physiology of elephants seems to be reasonably well understood, knowing that they have tusks, knowing that the trunk of an elephant can go around and grab things, that they know that the trunk is actually a very long nose. That's something you can't tell from a skeleton. So seems like the author knows about the basic physiology of a creature that he probably can't go and easily see on his own. It's almost like someone knowing, I don't know, the details of the Pool of Bethesda, just as an example, just throwing that out there. I guess because this person knows these details of elephant physiology, we have every reason to believe that Wukong fought a elephant demon and hit its trunk so hard that that's why he actually gave up and let his friend Bajia go when he was captured.
I mean,
Right?
how can you possibly explain the knowledge of the real physiological, appearances of elephants if it weren't for the fact that that war happened, like
Exactly. There is no plausible way that someone could know some basics about elephants. I mean,
right.
The only way that can make sense is that a monkey fought an elephant demon and had a whole bunch of rows back and forth, got tricked multiple times by that elephant demon, and eventually had to bring in the Buddha himself to put the elephant down. I'm not kidding. That's the story.
I'm not doubting it. I'm just,
So here we go. We got ourselves some external undesigned coincidences as well. I guess we really got to believe the story. Now, I know. The Apologist is saying this is all just a big straw man.
right.
We're comparing TV adaptations of a fantasy novel to the Gospels? Come on. Everyone knows Journey to the West is obvious fiction.
Right.
But, as we all know, the Gospels are sober accounts with historical sources, right?
Right.
Now, scholars, of course, are trying to use the Gospels to reconstruct the historical Jesus with limited success, let's put it that way. It's really hard to come to anything definitive about what the guy did or didn't do, ultimately, because our sources are, we might say, questionable in quality.
Mm-hmm.
What if I told you, though, that instead of all the questions about whether Jesus was historical or not, or what the historical Jesus did or didn't do, what if I could tell you that Journey to the West actually uses historical sources and is based on an actual epic journey to the West to get Buddhist scripture?
I mean, I'm open to it. Like I said, I'm open to it. As long
You
as
should be more than open to it, because not only can we say that the story is based on an earlier one, we have the earlier story. We have the book by Xuanzang from the 7th century and his own personal journey to the West. He was a Tang Dynasty monk traveling from China to India to get more up-to-date Mahayana Buddhist scriptures. And he gives these long autobiographical details of his journey to get there, all the adventures he had along the way, the arguments and debates he had, all the cool Buddhist stuff that he saw while he was in India, and then finally coming home and bringing all this great Enlightenment knowledge to Tang Dynasty China. This actually happened, and we know it is the basis for Journey to the West because sometimes the story is right on the nose telling you that. So, for example, Tang Sangzang, his name is Tang as in Tang Dynasty. He's a member of the Tang Dynasty royalty there. And in the story, his name at one point is actually Xuanzang. Literally the same name as this Tang Dynasty monk.
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, it's kind of obvious what they're trying to do here. I keep talking about Xuanzang and his story. I haven't really said too much about him, but there's a few things he does that feel a little bit familiar. So, like, there's this story that when he was born, his life was threatened as a baby, so his mother put him on a wooden raft and floated him down the Yangtze River, and then he was raised by monks to be safe from those trying to kill him as a child. If that sounds familiar to you, that could be your imagination.
I think I've heard of someone like Hammurabi, Moses, something like that. I don't know, man. It's something.
Beowulfenstein. That's it.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
Also, when I think about the story, there's also the part where after completing that mission, he's translated to heaven to become a deity along with the Buddha.
Wow.
Feels a little familiar.
That, I think I've heard of someone, maybe like Jesus or Josephus's story about Moses or Elijah. I could be wrong, but I thought they had a story somewhere about a man ascending to heaven, translating, having a metamorphosis. But I don't take my word for it. I think there's something like that.
Yeah, something we can check on that later.
Yeah.
There's a few other details about Sanzang that's also been interesting. His name, Sanzang. I've never shown you the Hanzi, the Chinese letters for his name. Sanzang literally is 3 books, 3 sacred scriptures, which is actually a direct translation of the Indian term for the Tripitaka. That is literally what Tripitaka means, the 3 holy books. So his name is literally Tang Dynasty Monk 3 books. What does he do? He goes all the way to the west to get the 3 holy books. Like I say, the story is on the nose with what its source is.
Wow.
So, like I say, when we say that Journey to the West is based on an historical record, it's because we literally have the historical record to compare it to, and we see all the traditions that exist between that record and the final version of Journey to the West. And there's other things as well. For example, there was also another monk named Wukong. And what did he do? He traveled from China to India to get Buddhist scripture. He did it at a different time than the historical Xuanzang, but nonetheless, the name wasn't completely random either. Also, when it comes to sources, Journey to the West actually cites its sources. It says, according to this poem, according to the I Ching, according to this book of calendars, or from these earlier stories of Sanzang and Wukong, that there were earlier versions of those stories floating around. They actually get copied. They actually get cited. We actually know what the sources are because Journey to the West actually goes out of its way to say, I'm citing X. Compare that, of course, to our Gospels, which never explicitly cite anything other than the Old Testament. And the only reason we know Matthew is citing Mark is because he's a copier and just doesn't actually tell us. We had to figure that out for our own sakes. So in terms of citation practice, the fantasy novel from China is better than the Gospels, and based on things that we can verify actually happened because we have the actual records. We don't have to reconstruct them. They're literally at the library right now.
You're persuading me. Yeah, you're persuading.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, Journey to the West has an objective historical core that we can recover. This isn't a theoretical or hypothetical sort of thing. We actually got the goods. This is so different than what goes on with historical Jesus studies, let alone mythologist studies. And by the way, all this stuff about reconstructing the history behind Journey to the West, guess what? No one uses undesigned coincidences of tellings between Journey to the West to find out what happened to the real Xuanzang. Because that's fucking stupid.
Right.
Let's be serious. No one does this. The way you actually get there is anything other than what the apologists have ever said.
It's amazing, even when you compare how apologists today, they don't use the arguments the earliest apologists use. Their apologetics is totally radically post-Enlightenment different than what you see in Justin Martyr, what you see in Origin, what you see in these guys, Eusebius and stuff. It's not the same.
Well, you're not convinced by the argument that there are 4 gospels because there's 4 corners of the earth and 4 winds?
I mean, look, I believe in flying monkeys, but I don't know if I believe in flying Jews yet. So,
Oh, I should also mention Sun Wukong. He's also Jesus in that he actually went to the underworld and came back through his own power, not because someone brought him back from the dead. He fought his way out. He literally went to the god of the underworld, threatened to beat the crap out of him, and then took the book of the dead from him and crossed his name out along with his other monkey subjects, making him immortal.
I mean,
did Jesus do that for us?
If it tells us this, we should probably consider it, especially if we don't have a human worldview. Like, we should really think this might be true. I mean, what have we not studied and learned on the earth that might be true as far as like dragons? And I mean, look at Lotan and Leviathan, right? Look at the beast in the chaotic waters that Enki and Enlil and well, the other name Ea and Mesopotamian literature, or go into Egyptian, right, with the crocodile gods and the Nile River demons, and like all of that stuff could be true. You know, we should, and they predate all the biblical stuff. So, what the heck are we doing? You know, we should be believing in some of this other stuff too, right?
Yes, and if you do believe in the Monkey King and you are good to him, he can bring you back to life. There are multiple stories in Journey to the West where he does bring good people back from the dead.
I mean, you guys, look, everybody in the chat right now, you see it. It's here. The truth is here. The Monkey King is Lord.
Yes. Yes. Well, it took him a long ways to get there, though. The Monkey King had to go through many trials and tribulations, had to be punished for some naughty things that he did. I'll save that for later if there are questions about that. But let's just wrap things up for now. So let's look at our conclusion. COG versus Katamarkan Evangelion. Monkey Magic versus Blood of the Lamb. Who wins?
Okay.
By the way, I'm not translating that to Monkey Magic. COG is the Chinese for Journey to the West, and Katamarkan Evangelion is Gospel According to Mark. Just to make sure no one thinks I'm thinking that's a translation of Blood of the Lamb. Okay.
Right.
But our conclusions here. Undesigned coincidences don't demonstrate squat when it comes to historical reliability. You have to basically assume pretty much everything that needs to be demonstrated. You have to pretty much assume the authenticity of all the traditional gospel stuff for this argument to have any persuasive power. On their own, internal undesigned coincidences do not address historicity at best. And this is, again, at best, they would suggest a common source. But honestly, especially with our gospels, more likely what we're seeing are redactions between sources.
Right.
In other words, at worst, the whole thing assumes that which needs to be shown. And perhaps most importantly, as the last half of this discussion has been, fictional stories can perfectly capably create these both internal and external undesigned coincidences, proving with that reductio ad absurdum they have no power in answering historical questions without assuming what needs to be proven. But if you're like me and you feel the enlightenment coming through, that you are able to break away from the needs and desires and the pains that life has brought you, then please join me as we all then move on and travel in our own journey to the West to seek enlightenment. Let us all move together. Come on. Where's my video? Shoot.
Come on, Monkey King.
Oh well, I guess I can't show the last clip. I was going to show the outro to the 86 version of Journey to the West. But
try it again. Try and refresh it real quick.
I'll try. If I hit refresh, it'll start from the very beginning.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah, so, meh.
Try to go back one. Oop, now go forward again.
It's going the opposite direction. Oh, there we go. And...
nothing.
Oh. My Spidey sense says I'm terrible.
Oh my gosh.
Oh well. We can live with that.
Okay, I'm going to bring you.
The whole point of enlightenment is to break away from attachments, so it's okay that the video didn't work as expected.
Right, it didn't work. There are other spirits at play right now, trying to fight the spirits of the Monkey King, because in their worldview, they're not so narrow-minded that they exclude all other worldviews. They actually like permit the various demons and gods and all that kind of stuff. So.
And it's probably best not try to upset the YouTube monetization gods.
That's another, I was going to say that's a whole other thing.
The Monkey King is wise in not dooming us to our avarice just because we wanted one last clip. But
right.
I will just say that what I was planning on showing was basically how the outro to the original CCTV show would end. If you are curious and you want to watch it, the entirety of the series is on YouTube for free with subtitles. So if you want, you can watch that. I will say the special effects, they're from the 80s, so they're going to feel a bit off. It looks very VHS quality, but the story itself is, like I say, it's basically a classic. You really would miss out on a lot of East Asian culture by not knowing that tale.
I really just, okay, jokes aside, we had a lot of fun through this whole stream, and I'm just having a hoot playing games, and today was just like, let's just have fun. But what the takeaway is again, that was brought up by Dr. Jeffrey Tripp. I mean, others will point out fictional material has these what look like interlocking materials and ideas that kind of connect. You showed it here with another example. Endless fictional material does this. And when I ask, like when I had these conversations online with, I think it was Eric, when I wrote Eric one day, Eric Manning, for those who don't know, who's the undesigned coincidence guy, is like really pushing it forward more than I think anyone on YouTube right now. And he was bringing up the idea that, well, nothing, you won't find other examples of any other material. Like this is the only material that's going to have this like crisscrossing, answering question, undesigned coincidence. They've kind of created this massive bubble of web. It's almost like this huge spider web of all these ideas that they have concocted. And I imagine much of it is in the head. And then much of it is probably through the fact that they have the common source. They're working with the literature. But like, I felt like when David Palleman, who's another one of the proponents who I know is pushing this stuff, like he is more philosophical minded, but same kind of fundamentalist, biblical text, historicity, undesigned coincidence kind of approach. And he brought up something about the empty tomb, post-resurrection scenes that, and I can't remember the exact example, but John is answering something in Luke, or Luke's answering something from John. And it was like this weird thing. And when I went and looked at it, I was like, I mean, I see Matthew, when he tried to use Matthew or Luke, whichever one it was, answering a problem that Mark has, because Mark has the women were afraid. They went and told no one. They don't have a post-resurrection scene or anything. So I see a simple solving a problem from an earlier text that you don't like the ending to, so you create a new one. And it got so like complicated in the weeds. I'm like, I don't understand as well. You're not getting it. It seems like you're just not open to understanding. I'm like, no, I don't think you're making any sense. Like, I don't see
which is part of the thing that I started with, saying like, hey, let's try to break down the logic, because when you do, you actually realize it ain't there.
There's so much that I just was like, what in the world? And by the way, for anyone who's interested, Aaron wanted to do this episode. I kind of feel like hanging up the whole topic with them, because you're not going to get anywhere. Like with anyone who's sold on the undesigned coincidence stuff, it is an unfalsifiable empire for them. And they're only trying to validate. They're not scientifically trying to poke holes in it. And every time anything gets brought up, Matthew Hartke had a conversation with Eric Manning the other day, when the explanation from everyone, consensus, scholarship on these issues, which don't worry, consensus, throw that away. Don't even care. Who gives a shit what consensus thinks? They're probably, the way I think the mind works for many of them is, if the consensus holds it, it's probably most likely wrong when it comes to biblical studies. So,
well, it's wrong if the consensus doesn't come to their conclusions, because when the consensus is on their side, boy, oh boy, do they tout that. I mean, how often will an apologist point to say, even Bart Ehrman says this?
Yeah, that's the Bart Ehrman fallacy that I hear all the time, of course. But yeah, it just seems like you're never going to get anywhere. And every time anything gets brought up, and if you try to compare, God forbid, you try to show birth narratives, fictional narratives constructed with noblemen, Caesars from Suetonius, birth narratives from other tales, barren women in the Hebrew Bible, which have commonalities to other stories in the ancient Near East, in Ugarit, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. You can't do that. They don't give a hoot. None of that takes away in their head any validity to this one myth. And yes, it is a legend. It is a myth. It is not true. It did not happen. This one is the golden rock. You can't get them to see how comparative mythology, comparative legends, and how this was a common topos in literature writing would make a dent. It doesn't work for Michael Jones. It doesn't work for Eric Manning. It doesn't work for the Apologists. They cannot see how that works. They've gone even further in saying stuff like, well, if I was God, I would work within the fiction in order to bring about the truth. I don't know about
And
you, man.
I'm willing to accept that as a premise, but then say, okay, if fiction can also be true, which fiction? Oh, we now got the same problem. Guess what? You didn't do anything to make this probable. You just came up with a just so story with no way of actually showing what's real other than assuming what you wanted to at the beginning. Because again, I can make the exact same thing and say, yes, look at all these things that happen in Journey to the West. You got basically a Moses story. You got a Jesus story. You got actual redemption. You got actual character growth that honestly is pretty missing from most of the Bible stories, honestly.
That's why I like a lot of the authors who kind of say up front, like Plutarch will say stuff like, this is fabuli. He'll describe it as fabuli, meaning it's a fable, meaning this isn't history. This did not happen. He calls it what it is. And when you get someone like him who knows the stories of his own Greek and Roman ancestry and their traditions, and they're pointing out in their own traditions, look at this. This is fabuli. This is fable. 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 When you get used to seeing these birth narratives, the miraculous claims, the divinity, wild stuff that you might find in the tales, and calls them fables, then you get to the Gospels and you see these very same tropes, very same literary aspects that are identical to what we're finding in Plutarch, or we're finding in Suetonius, or we're finding it elsewhere in the Greek and Roman and Jewish world, because they're all doing this stuff. It's a melting pot of myth and fabuli. It's fable. And you get to this and you go, well, that's fable too. What? No, our God worked magically through all of the fables of the world to bring about the real fable, the C.S. Lewis myth. This one is true. Prove me wrong. It's not true. And it's like, I don't look at the literature. Look at what the heck are we going to do? Your undesigned coincidence thing was good today, though. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, I'm at least glad we can have some fun with it. And like I say, probably also introduce some more people to another collection of stories out there. I'm not going to say they're necessarily better than the other stories you may have heard of, but like I say, this novel in particular, Journey to the West, is one of the 4 classics of Chinese culture and is definitely worth knowing for that reason.
Absolutely. Do we have any? I'm going to go back to
our comment section.
I think we do have a super chat. Constellation Pegasus. There it is. Aaron, thank you for this. Entertaining, exciting, and insightful. Excellent work here.
Thank you very kindly.
Yeah, I really appreciate you putting it together, and really appreciate the time and energy and having fun, right? Having fun with just making fun a little bit of the whole thing, because I've bumped into it and realized real quick, there's no persuading on that. And we are taking completely different approaches. I'm looking and going, all right, I'm using a heuristic approach to all literature at large in the known world. And I see topos, meaning I see practices or traditions that are common among literature that is fictional, that is legendary. And I also see what a lot of the scholars think about with antecedents to Greek literature, maybe even Latin literature with the Virgil. I do see some competitiveness going on between what's happening with the I wanted to say Augustus, but really it's the Caesar descendancy Roman imperial cult and Jesus. And there's rivalry happening in the literature. I see all this stuff. And I think when I'm approaching it, looking at it as literature, and I go to the we passages, for example, and the we passages show up when, is it Troas, the modern form of Troy? The we passages we find in the Odyssey in book 10, where it starts to talk about we passages on a journey on a boat. Just 2 different perceptions, completely different perceptions on how we're viewing this material. What gives the sign away to me is that story arc, how the narrative flows, and the over and over fantastic stuff. If you told me a monkey's flying on a cloud and he has these magical powers and all this stuff. I'm going to be super suspect of, did this really happen? And tell me if you agree with me, Aaron. I think most rational people, as long as it's not their own bubble that you're touching, would also look at it and go, yep, that's crazy. Monkeys flying on a cloud. What would be the point of a monkey flying on a cloud? But then you get to their own scripture. You go to the Hebrew Bible and show God, El or Yahweh, depending on the context, most likely Yahweh, is fighting chaos dragons that breathe fire named Leviathan or Lotan. And you find that very myth in the previous mythical literature in Ugarit, in the Levant, with El and his wife Asherah, which later inscriptions show Yahweh and his Asherah. And like, come on, God has a wife, he has kids, he has children. We see this pantheon in Deuteronomy 32 with Yon as the head honcho, with Yahweh as one of his sons. I mean, at what point do the dominoes fall and then you realize?
I guess the thing is, though, if you've already started believing from chapter 3 of Genesis that talking snakes doesn't even give you pause, then what's to stop you after there?
That's true. But that one's true. And the Mesopotamian versions of the snake that took Gilgamesh's plant, that's not true. Any other snake mythology?
I mean, obviously that snake story is fake. I mean, what else are you going to tell me? There's talking donkeys in the Bible or something ridiculous?
I know. How silly, right? Thinking of Asclepius, that's obviously not true. Hermes with his staff, his snakes. Come on, man. That's not. Let's get out of here with that nonsense.
I know.
Elijah in a chariot, flying up into heaven, that something about that rings true, but Romulus ascending, that's bullshit. Even though he had an eyewitness, Proculus Julius, who actually saw it. And then they have tradition, which says this stuff happened. That's absurd. The Caesars ascending post-death through the pyre and their bones are missing. That's absurd. Jesus, that sounds true. You know what I mean? Right?
Praise Vespasian.
Yeah, that was another one of the undesigned coincidences Jeffrey Tripp brought up was the the whole idea that he healed a blind man or stepped on the withered hand and healed them. And there's multiple accounts that describe it.
Yep, we got multiple accounts from well-known historians who we know did have access to sources, and we actually know who the F they are. It's like, how can you even begin to compare and say, well, this is clearly illegitimate, but our story, we have some way somehow of claiming that our healing story is true, but not the imperial one, because only politics exists in Rome, but not in Judea.
It's weird that you kind of made me think of something that I've noticed being online when Islam gets brought up on my channel and I'm being critical. Muslims will come out and they'll talk about, just read the Quran. Just read the Quran. It is the best written book in the world. It is this, that about the Quran. It's the most poetic. They had competitions back in the day and it won, and no other book compares to the Quran, and all this stuff, right? That like nobody could do or remake. Nobody could even come close to writing a book that good. And it's so subjective that they have this kind of position. And as long as you get enough people following in the same line and regurgitating the same thing, it just multiplies through the next generation of people who also have the same opinion, and you ask the same Christian apologists about their own text, and they'll look at that and go, the Quran? Come on, are you kidding me? Well, Muslim apologists think it, and they think this is somehow persuadable, like that this is the most beautiful, eloquent. I don't see it, but you see what I'm saying.
I do. I follow.
I don't know. So nobody had any other questions before I go?
Get those questions in. Try to...
Oh my gosh.
I'm just trying to quickly go through, see if anything's popping up. Oh.
Dirk says, Dirk will prove it by giving God's name, Asher, I was just reading through, as I'm doing the documentary, reading through God and Anatomy here. This book, oh my gosh, this is just Groundbreaking. I mean, I took my time through reading it over the past 5 days, and just while crafting and constructing my script, and there's so much in here that shows how man-made the whole enterprise is, and how they buried God. They buried God. They really did, by making God outside space and time, beyond our perception, where he doesn't have a body. That just blew me away to see how that happened over time.
And the fact that they even had to move him outside of space because of what we ended up learning. And if only somebody had a book to talk about that sort of problem. I don't know.
Absolutely. You know, no shameless plugs here. We don't do that. We do not do that. I hope that people will check out your book, though. That's for sure. Let me see. Nobody has a question?
I guess everyone was just so enthralled by the exploits of the Monkey King. The multiply immortal Monkey King.
Yes, and I'm totally going to worship him as soon as I go up there and eat my lunch. You know, he's
well, specifically, if you want to eat with him, you probably want to eat the flat peaches up in the Heavenly Peach Garden, because if you eat one of those peaches, you will be granted immortality. Problem is, earlier Wukong was supposed to be guarding those peaches, got upset, and ate all of them.
Absolutely. Look, someone asked you for your book. Like, where is your book, or what is your book? You got 2 books: Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, and then you have Aliens and Religion, where 2 worlds collide. And that's the question of, what if aliens are here? Would they trouble the idea of God? Would they trouble the idea of Christianity? And diving into some of the claims about aliens, just in case anybody's wondering, that link to the Amazon books is pinned at the top of the chat right now. We got a question here, though, by Humano. How did they bury God when the Bible is just divine revelation? There's a lot of assumption in the idea that this is divine revelation, but
even taking it as revelation, the body of God was buried because people looked at that revelation and they said, it can't mean that, because we don't like what that implies.
Exactly. So let me put it another way for you, Humano, and in case, I don't know if you're a believer or not, you should check this book out if you're curious about the truth, wanting to know the historical facts and data. But here's the problem. This is what Francesca points out. The Bible tells you, the book that you're saying is Revelation, tells you about God's body, his hands, his head, his feet, his voice, his eyes. And the way that it describes it in the same very language is applied to humans. These humans also, with their feet and their mouth and their head and their eyes and the whole 9. I mean, the list goes on and on. She shows this, and she shows how scribes post-Babylon, post-destruction of Jerusalem's temple, were crying out and saying, where are you, Yahweh? Did you go off on a slumber? The same way when Elijah was arguing with Baal worshipers, saying, where is Baal? Is he on a journey? Is he taking a crap? That's what the Hebrew implies there. She talks about that as well. Is he defecating? Where's your God at? Well, the same problem happened when Jerusalem got crushed by Babylon, because they thought Yahweh, the warrior deity, was going to defend them and help them win this battle against Babylon. It didn't work for them. It didn't work against Rome. You know, the list goes on and on. So where's Yahweh? Why are we getting our asses handed to us? God's supposed to defend us. They rationalize over time, finally, when the Persians allow them to come back, and they say, oh, you know what? Actually, Yahweh's always been there. The problem is we sinned. And because of our faults, Yahweh can't be in our presence, and he let us be punished. So they found ways to rationalize. When they did that, not only did Yahweh become only exclusively centralized to Jerusalem's temple, but he also became someone you hid away. They didn't deny his body yet, but they did deny his visibility to people. That's why you find in the New Testament contradictions where Jesus says, no one has seen God except the Son. Explicitly, no one has seen God, but people can't wait to see God face to face. Go to Exodus. Moses saw God and talked to him face to face. He saw God face to face. He's not the only one who saw God according to the Bible. So this same
depends on the version, though, because sometimes Moses has to talk to God's butt.
There are times, well, that I love that scene in the book where she points out we still use it today. You turned your back on me. That's actually a negative derogatory thing. Like if someone turns their back on you or stabs you in the back, we still use these euphemisms to describe someone betraying us in a real sense. So that was seen in the Bible in another place where Yahweh turned his back on Israel. Yahweh turned his back. Well, when he says, show me your back parts, it's not his back. It's his butt. Now, he didn't ask him to show him his butt. He asked God to show him his glory. Well, you can't look at God's glory and live. So, because it's all brilliant, bright. And you go, well, yeah, God's a burning fire. God's a brilliant light. She goes through Ugarit. She goes through Mesopotamia. She goes to Egypt. She shows you all these other gods are bright, brilliant gods you're not allowed to look at in their glory. So this is not a unique deity. This God is not unique.
Oh, yeah.
She constructs.
And this also does translate to the East as well, because Buddha is also described of immense size and glowing glory.
Exactly. And in Hinduism with Vishnu, you can see the same thing going on. But like all of this goes on in saying your Bibles tell you, your English translations sometimes are fudged on purpose, because burying Moses, for example, she goes through a section where they later on, theology by later Christians and Jews were reading these ancient books and going, hold on, God can't touch the dead. That would make him unclean and defiled. And God is never unclean and defiled. So that scribe who wrote that God buried Moses, the corpse of Moses, it couldn't have been God buried it. So now in our translations, it says they buried Moses. But the Hebrew says God did. So they found ways to brush God from existence into hiding him. And later on, what happens is, thanks to Plato, thanks to Socrates, the Platonic Xenophanes too, the Greek philosophy infiltrated in the Hellenistic world Jewish and Christian thought, and God died a slow death. She describes that in the eulogy at the end of the book. Over time, the body of God is permanently buried. And now Christians and Jews want to go, he's out there, an energy, a force, an essence. He's not a physical being like all the ancient Near Eastern gods, which the Bible describes him as. So that God, this is why I can't wait to drop the documentary. She puts God in his place. If anything, she resurrects Yahweh from the dead and shows you God's actual body, and then explains to you that, yes, almost that Nietzsche quote, we've killed him. You can thank the philosophers that influenced Christianity and Jews over time for killing the body of God and making it into something that is just abstract, some force being outside space and time and such. And I'm so glad that she did this and showing it using heuristic approaches and comparative, like showing here he is in the Levant. We have temples of him. We have statues of him, just like we have everywhere else. And all of the language that describes these other physical deities who had actual bodies is applied in the Bible for Yahweh and El. Why are we saying that he doesn't have a body? Why are we saying he's not like them? Later on, we have to fix that. That's exactly what they do. And they do it in the Bible too. So,
well, if I can do, I guess you could call it one-upmanship, let me also bring it back to the embodiment and disembodiment of the Buddha as well in Journey to the West, because one of the famous scenes in there is the bet between Buddha and Wukong. So at this point in the story, Sun Wukong is completely out of control, and he is completely destroying all of heaven. He's able to defeat all of their armies. Everything is smashing up. The Jade Emperor, the one who's running heaven, basically says, we need the Buddha to come in and help us. And so literally the Buddha appears, this giant glowing entity, and is chatting with Wukong and saying, this isn't really how things are supposed to be going. The Jade Emperor is in the position he is because of all the lives he had gone through in that. Right. So I'm going to make a bet with you, Wukong. Wukong hops into the giant hand of Buddha, is holding him here for this conversation, and says, I'm going to make a bet with you. If you win, Monkey King, then I will make you basically king of the universe. You'll take the place of the Jade Emperor in heaven. But if you lose, I will punish you. Wukong is like, all right, I'm for it. And all that the Buddha says that Wukong needs to do is jump out of my hand. And Wukong is like, I can hop on a cloud and fly anywhere. This is easy. All right. So he jumps up and he literally jumps. I think the story says he jumps 108,000 li, which basically means he jumps to the edge of the earth, to the literal pillars on the western edge of the world, sees the pillars there, jumps all the way there. Is like, well, this was easy, but I got to make sure I prove that I got all the way here. So he pulls out some of his fur, transforms it into a brush and into ink, and then basically writes the equivalent of Wukong was here on the pillars. And also to really make sure he left his mark, he also peed on the pillars. Really leave his mark there, and then jumped all the way back into the hand of Buddha. And then Buddha says, well, have you left yet or not? It's like, what do you mean, Buddha? I already jumped. I went to the very edge of the world. Take a look and you see that I'm there. And Buddha, talking to Wukong in his hand, says, turn around. And Wukong turns around and sees on the fingers of Buddha's hand, Wukong was here, and smells urine.
Oh my gosh.
And Buddha says, I am everywhere. You can't possibly escape. I am in all places. You lose. Punish time.
Oh, that's so funny, dude. Now that's believable.
So you want to, yeah. So if you want to embodied and disembodied God, Buddha's got you. Buddha's got you.
Buddha's got it. Melly says, great presentation. I enjoy reading novels. And I think every single one I've read references, alludes to Journey to the West in some way.
A lot, along with Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. Those probably have the most influence on a lot of manga and anime.
Thank you so much for that. I'm getting warm. Getting close to the presence of the deity here, and it's getting hot. Constellation Pegasus says, did Oppenheimer leave any notes on why he loved the Mahabharata?
I honestly don't know what the documentation is there, but for everyone's sake, so Robert Oppenheimer, the person who basically ran the operation for making the first atomic weapon, wanted to read the Mahabharata, the Indian classic, and so he learned Sanskrit, so he could actually do his own translation. And so famously, when the first weapon was detonated, he said that he remembered from the sacred scriptures the line from there where I think it was Vishnu was trying to show the king that he needs to do his duty to actually fight, that is his purpose in life, and shows him his ultimate form, like basically like take away the veil to show like how awesome and powerful he is, and then translate this, I now have become death, destroyer of worlds. And that was the imagery that he had when he unleashed the hidden power of the atom. Now, why Oppenheimer wanted to read Indian stuff there, I understand there was a bit of a craze for Eastern wisdom already in the late 19th, early 20th century. If that's the reason, I honestly don't know. I have not read the biography of him enough to say.
Thank you so much for that, Constellation. I really appreciate you showing up and showing love and all of that. We got a question here just saying, hey to Lauren, good to see you here. Aunt Jer says, are Wukong, I don't even know how to properly pronounce the name, but and Hanuman related?
I'm gonna take a guess. I think Hanuman is a Indian monkey deity, and it's a possible inspiration for Sun Wukong. But I don't know the details. From what I understand, it's not clear the ultimate origins of why a monkey, other than monkeys are silly and get into all sorts of interesting trouble.
Right. Maybe there's something there. Ken says, hey, Derek, have you seen? Yes, I have. I think non-traditional Catholics. Oh, hold on. Maybe I haven't. I'd love to see you two chat. I don't know who that is. I'd have to look it up. But all right, I am going to head on up and eat my lunch here. Any final words from you, Aaron?
Well, I am glad that we had a chance to go through this, talk about some other stories, not just pull our hair out with bad apologetics. and hopefully inspired us to learn even more myths, because our vision needs to get wider and wider for all the other possible stories that we get to learn and interpret. So, 我很高兴我可以看看你们。
Thank you so
Glad I
much.
can see you all, and 再见. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. Stay tuned. I've got some documentaries coming, and thank you all for everybody's support. Those who support us on Patreon, you make this possible, continuing the research and bringing more great information to the world. So thank you.